Okay, we're going to start this morning. I have one correction, actually two corrections. Last week we spoke, or week before last, we spoke about interest groups, and I said the Koch brothers' net worth was $115 billion, which is more or less true, but I misstated the annual budget of the state of Indiana, which is apparently about $30 billion. So these two brothers are worth maybe 3 to 4 times what the annual budget of your state is. I also talked about their felony convictions and many misdemeanor convictions, but did not bother to point out that they never have received a prison sentence and have never served any time in prison. So there's still, since many states have laws against people who've been convicted of felonies that prevent them from voting, at least for a time and maybe forever, this is not an unimportant piece of information, not to mention if any of you have been convicted of 6 felonies, I doubt you'd be sitting in this class. Okay, but today we're going to talk about political parties. Any questions before I start? Okay. Keep in mind that we're speaking just about political parties in the United States, and sometimes parties in other countries are a bit different than those in the United States. So in the United States, a political party is a political organization whose main purpose is to find candidates to stand for election and to win elections. Their second purpose is to try to control the government or some segments of the government and to shape and determine public policy. One of the many things that makes this difficult is that the major U.S. parties tend to have factions or smaller groups that try to obtain power, benefits, and or influence policy. So we'll get back to this in a little bit. The idea that a political party is a totally unified group of actors with the identical ideology or the identical policy preferences is usually not accurate. Some parties come closer than others, but unity is very difficult, if only because we're a nation of 50 states. And as you're well aware, many of these states differ from one another, both in terms of their economies, their culture, their population, and so we would expect that if members of parties were somewhat representative of the states in which they're from, that they're going to reflect that to some degree. Political scientists often distinguish between political parties and interest groups. Interest groups seek to influence government, though political parties or office holders might be tied closely to some interest groups. Interest groups generally are seen, and not always correctly, but generally seen as distinct from parties in that they don't want to run the government, they want favorable policy from governments. Parties, on the other hand, are involved directly in setting up in elections, in recruiting candidates for elections, and trying to win elections. Interest groups rarely themselves seek to run or win in elections. Both, however, are what political scientists refer to as linkage organizations. And you'll see this in an image that's coming up that helps define what a linkage organization is. My computer is there we go. It's very slow this morning. So I need to do something about this. I have to get this page working right. I'm still not doing it. Okay. I'll have another comment on the bottom of this slide when I repost the PowerPoint on Blackboard. A linkage organization, I said parties and interest groups are both linkage organizations. The linkage is reflected in this image. Can you see this image okay?
Yeah.
So the linkage is between individuals, and I might add groups of various kinds on the one hand, and what in theory what parties and interest groups do in different ways is to aggregate, is to pull together the different constituencies, different individuals, different points of view that then get reflected in and communicated to those who hold office in the executive branch, in legislative branches, and in the courts, and the outcome is public policies, laws, programs, decisions, actions. This reflects, if you go back to the very first class, this chart is very similar to, this image is very similar to the one that is associated with the political scientist David Easton that I posted. He'll give me just a second here. I will try to get this other comment that I had on here. So just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's missing from this chart, and I'll bring it back up in a minute, is fundraisers, contributors, and what are called bundlers. And you can find some of this information on OpenSecrets.com. And there, for example, one of the, what makes this work to the degree that it does is money. And so some candidates and party organizations or political organizations or interest groups have mostly small contributors, and others have big contributors. And note too that office holders and decision makers in the box are also members of parties and interest groups. And so there's a tendency, and we've talked about this before, to act as though in the old days of political science, political scientists tended to argue that parties and interest groups were kind of outside government, and then legislators and executives and courts were the government, and that these were political organizations. Parties and interest groups are really part of political processes, but not part of government, and that's really incorrect. And there's a mutual interpenetration between legislators, executives, and courts on the one hand, and parties and interest groups on the other. And the only way to examine that, the only way to talk about that is to examine it in each case. There's no theory, there's no formula that will determine precisely what that relationship is. But the idea that interest groups and parties are somehow totally distinct from legislative bodies, executive branch agencies, and the courts just doesn't fly. And we've said this before, perhaps in different ways. So parties have a number of functions. The first is really to recruit candidates to run for office. Because if you don't have any candidates to run for office, obviously you can't win elections. So this is, in many ways, the first function or role of parties. You got to find candidates. It should be noted that both parties tend to like to recruit wealthy candidates, either personally wealthy candidates or candidates who have very wealthy political backers. Why do you think that might be?
A lot of money to run a campaign.
You're going to have to speak up.
It takes a lot of money to run a campaign.
Yep. It not only takes a lot of money, and obviously some media markets are much more expensive than others, but not only does it take a lot of money, but if the candidate brings a boatload of money to his or her campaign, that means the party organization doesn't have to raise money or give money to that candidate, but rather can raise money and spend money on behalf of other candidates whose pockets aren't as deep. Not to pick on the Democratic Party, but I'll just give you two examples. I can't remember their names exactly, but I can remember the states and the specifics. So the governor of Minnesota is a Democrat, and he used to be a U.S. Senator from Minnesota. And his money was, I think his name was Mark Dayton. He was an heir to the Target Corporation money. His family got its wealth owning and running Target and owning Target as a business. And then there was a woman whose name escapes me from the state of Washington who became a multimillionaire at least during the tech boom in the 1990s, and she used her wealth to get in a position to run for and to win election as a senator from the state of Washington. Another example of that is, although she didn't win, is Meg Whitman. Meg Whitman was the former CEO of eBay, and I think she ran. Actually, there were two women who, Carly Simon was the other. Not Carly Simon. Carly Fiorina. Carly Simon's a singer. Carly Fiorina, who is the former CEO of Hewlett Packard, and Meg Whitman, who is now CEO of Hewlett Packard, but who made her money as CEO of eBay. Both women ran for, I think, U.S. Senate in different years in California. Both were defeated, but their candidacies were possible. Or think of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor in California, famous actor, and obviously had a lot of money as a consequence. And so being a candidate with deep pockets is an advantage, both to the candidate and to the party. Parties also organize and run elections. Elections, technically, are not a governmental function. They are to some modest degree, but you would be shocked, I think, to know that the extent to which the two major political parties organize and run elections. They organize and run party primaries, the schedules of primary elections. They dominate and control boards of elections in each county in the country. They set the rules for local and state elections and elections more broadly. And in each state, the state secretary of state is usually the official who makes decisions about how elections are going to be run, and that person is almost always a Democrat or a Republican. It should be pointed out, I won't mention his political party, but that in the past, 5 years, the Indiana Secretary of State had to resign and was convicted of or pled guilty to election fraud. So everything about election. I'll just give you one example, the most extraordinary example that I can think of. Going into the, I'm not sure whether it was it must have been going into the 2008 election. Yeah, I think it was going into the 2008 election. The Republican Party had been winning the presidency quite often. And, of course, George Bush was president from 2001 to 2009. And, of course, the country changes over time. And in presidential elections, in the presidential election in 2008, the Democratic Party National Committee got together and developed a strategy for how the presidential primary election should be scheduled. Their thinking was, see, up until that time, for the most part, the state governments set the primary election schedules and dates for each state. And they change them, they can change them, and have and do. So what the Democratic National Committee said is, and by the way, the two pretty much sacrosanct states in the presidential primary process are Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa has the first caucus, which occurs usually in January when the snow is up to your waist, and then in usually very early February, New Hampshire has the first presidential primary. And so when you see politicians, senators, governors going to Iowa, going to New Hampshire, starting about 2 years before the presidential election, you know they're testing the waters to see whether they may run for president. But what the Democratic National Committee did was to say the schedule of primaries that's set up by the various states based on what their legislatures passed, we don't think really works for us. And so we want to change it, and we are changing it, so that we have diverse kinds of states early on, so that this doesn't bias the outcome. So the Democratic National Committee said, we want Nevada, a western state, to be one of the first states. South Carolina can continue to be one of the early states, which it has been in the past. So can New Hampshire, that's a New England state, and then Iowa, a Midwestern state. So they wanted states that represented different regions of the country and presumably somewhat different demographics, so that it wouldn't bias the outcome of the primary process because if one candidate wins the first 3 or 4 primaries, usually they can attract a lot of money, and the money dries up for other candidates. So now that itself was pretty extraordinary. But then what they said, then what the Democratic National Committee said was, Florida, Michigan, you guys are trying to move your primaries up and mess up what we're trying to do here. And if you don't reverse the laws that you passed, scheduling the primaries early, we are going to not count your primary elections in the 2008 election, in the presidential primaries in the Democratic Party. We're not going to count those, and we're going to ask all of the candidates on the Democratic side to not campaign in your states because you are not going along with the schedule that we've set up. Now, I cannot remember that ever happening. I'm not saying this to criticize the Democratic National Committee. I'm saying it to show that the degree to which party organizations can have a dramatic formative impact on almost every single thing about how elections are run. Okay, and that's just the kind of poster child of the most obvious example. Any comments or questions on that? One other point about this party function of organizing and running elections, because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are the 2 dominant parties in American politics, they have no interest generally in formulating election rules and regulations and processes that make it easy for third-party candidates to compete, and they don't. Okay, other functions of parties. They tend to present policy alternatives. They may well be, depending on the composition of the government, responsible for running it, and they may act sometimes as an organized opposition. Comments at this point or questions? Okay, I'm going to run through the history of parties in the U.S. pretty quickly. We are a 2-party system, or at least a 2-party dominant system. There are unique historical forces like slavery and federalism have had a significant impact on the creation and maintenance of the 2-party system. The 2-party system is also linked to the government created by the Constitution, that is to say, and the founding, that is to say, those who wanted a stronger federal government, those who were worried about that, and wanted states to have more rather than less control. And so that tension between the national government and state governments has been an important and enduring, a formative part of party organizations. Single-member districts are also important in creating a 2-party system. What's a single-member district? We elect 435 members of the House of Representatives. They each represent a district based on population within the 50 states. A single-member district electoral rule means that the candidate with the most votes wins the entire district. One official, one candidate is going to be elected from each district, and the way that one can assure that there is one and only one winner is if one candidate gets 50% plus 1 votes. And so a single-member district electoral rule helps create a two-party system and sustain a two-party system, because that's a certain way that you know that you've elected one person. My computer is very slow today. Okay, so there are perhaps four major periods in the history of political parties in the U.S. One is the Civil War to the post-Civil War period in the last half of the 19th century. A period up till from the end of the 19th century to 1932, period of Republican domination, and although the progressives were also a force in that period. The New Deal from 1932 to 68, and the current period of frequently divided and stalemated government from 1968 on. Okay, so initially, the Democrats and Whigs were the two dominant parties. This goes back to the early 19th century. And after the Civil War, the parties reconfigured, and so you had the emergence of the Democratic Party and the founding of the Republican Party. And after the Civil War, the new party system featured a Republican Party that was victorious, generally representing the northern industrial economy. We were now entering a period of industrialization, at least in the North, and a struggling Democratic Party that generally represented the southern agrarian economy, in contrast to the northern industrial economy. So the Democratic Party's base after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, through most of the rest of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, was the South. And the Republicans became known as the Grand Old Party. They gained an edge in the 1890s and began to be more powerful in the early parts of the 20th century. But also at that time was the development of the progressive movement, and Theodore Roosevelt was perhaps one the president who is most identified with progressivism, and that caused a split in the Republican Party prior to World War I. And Woodrow Wilson's election in 1916 marked a significant change in the Democratic Party. You've probably heard the phrase or the sentence, 9/11 changed everything. Well, the Great Depression changed everything in American government and politics, or almost everything. And in response to the failure of the Republicans, Coolidge and Hoover, especially Hoover, to do anything of significance in terms of a response to the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 and took office in early 1933. And Franklin Roosevelt he and his advisors initiated what came to be called the New Deal. And the New Deal wasn't just a period of various kinds of policies that involved a significantly new set of roles really for the federal government, but it also created a new political coalition. Political parties all in the United States are coalitions of various groups and interests. And the New Deal coalition is described here on this slide. Working class and union members, especially urbanites, white ethnics that were previously aligned with Republican machines. These might be Irish, Italians, Poles, Catholics and Jews, especially recent immigrants, African Americans finally began to switch their allegiance from the Republican Party, which, of course, keep in mind, Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republican Party after the Civil War, from the South's point of view, came down hard on the southern states, which is why they became Democratic during that in the aftermath of the Civil War. Blacks began to be Democrats. Poor people, Southern whites, remained as a loyal bloc of the Democratic Party during the New Deal. Since then, we've had what it might be called some wave elections, where the partisan balance between the Democratic and Republican parties in Congress stays relatively close, but there are temporary and sometimes significant shifts of parties in power. So a wave election is one where there's a significant change in the party composition of the Congress. The fact is, however, and I think we'll see this in a bit, that both parties have probably lost some popularity over time. This is a map of the 2012 presidential election vote, and it is incorrect for one state that I want to call to your attention, and that is West Virginia. West Virginia should not be blue. West Virginia is red. And what this map shows a number of things about the country, at least in terms of national politics. First, the Electoral College is incredibly important in determining who is elected president. Each state doesn't get one vote. Okay? More states voted for Mitt Romney than voted for Barack Obama. However, the states that did vote for Barack Obama, on balance, tended to be larger in population and hence had more Electoral College votes. So if you look at the states with the largest electoral votes, what do you find? California, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, and Texas are the largest states with the largest Electoral College votes, and only Texas went to Mitt Romney. So, and Ohio also went to President Obama. So Michigan also. So you can see that the president won those states, for the most part, won the states with the largest amount of Electoral College votes. So geography matters. What else can you see? Well, the 2012 election was pretty close to a rerun of the 2008 election in terms of outcome. Only two states, Indiana and North Carolina, voted differently between the two elections. In 2008, both states voted for President Obama. In 2012, they voted for Romney. So this map shows that at least in the last two elections, there was very little change in terms of presidential voting. So that's all. I mean, when you think about how much money was spent in this 2012 election, and this is how much difference there was. Only two states out of 50. That's 4%. Okay, what else can you see? Well, you can see that the northern states in the eastern half of the country are still tending to vote Democratic. Obviously, Virginia is not a northern state, but if you divide the country in half geographically, it's still pretty much the North. You have 3 states, Florida, New Mexico, and Colorado, that are heavily Latino. Colorado a bit less so, but certainly New Mexico and Florida. Many of the people in Florida are seniors who used to live up in the industrial north and northeast and now live in Florida. And then you have a coastal thing going on. Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Hawaii, all Democratic. And so most of the West and South is voting Republican in presidential elections, at least the last 2. And most of the coast, I mean, North Carolina was with the exception of South Carolina and Georgia, and one of the 2 elections in North Carolina, the whole eastern coast is Democratic. And the whole western coast is Democratic. And you don't need to be a math wizard to look at this map and come to one conclusion. And that is, the Republican Party has held thus far the state of Texas. Okay? And one way, not the only way, but one important way to think about American government and politics is that it involves competition for power between the Republican and Democratic parties. Thus far, 50 years ago, Texas was pretty much a Democratic state. 80 years ago, even more so. That changed when the South became largely Republican. So, what is the issue? What is the social condition that is very important in terms of electoral outcomes? Simple answer, immigration. Latinos tend to vote probably 2-to-1 Democratic to Republican. If you take out Cuban Americans, it may even be higher than that. And so the votes in Colorado and New Mexico, and California for that matter, reflect the growing Latino population in these states. That population is also growing in Texas. As that population grows in Texas, the chances of the state of Texas in presidential politics going into the Democratic column are quite high. And once that happens, and it probably will happen, it will certainly happen in your lifetime, and it probably will happen in the next 10 to 20 years. Once that happens, the Republican Party is in deep trouble in terms of ever winning the presidency of the United States. This is essentially a math issue. Okay? Ask yourself, how does the Republican Party win the presidency if California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan start out, and all of New England start out in the Democratic column? It's virtually impossible. Any comments or questions? You guys there?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I'm not advocating one thing or another. What I am trying to point out is that one of the things the Electoral College does with presidential politics is it is possible it is possible that the great majority of states with very few electoral college votes can remain Republican, that the Democratic Party in presidential elections has the opportunity, if Texas goes Democratic, the Republican Party nationally, with respect to the White House and the presidency only, is in a very difficult position. So these are the two parties today in terms of some of their most important constituents. And it's still affected pretty much by the old New Deal coalition. And just to move along, I'm going to keep on going. But I'll just say labor, racial and ethnic minorities, people who live in cities, less educated and very highly educated people, those who support social programs and healthcare policy, those who want more rather than less government management of the economy and regulation of business are going to tend to vote Democratic. Those who are going to tend to vote Republican are those who believe in very limited, small government, at least in theory, self-reliance, very few, if any, social programs, support the private sector and business as opposed to and let it make most of the decisions. Economic decisions, even if we get into a recession, and big business and white evangelical and rural constituencies. But culture and geography also play an important role in American national government and in defining the parties. And these cultural and geographic differences between the states have an impact both in state government but also in national politics. So, and for just some examples here, there are energy states like Texas and Oklahoma. There are tech-heavy states like Massachusetts, Washington, and California. There are environmentally oriented states like Oregon and Vermont. States with many Latinos like Florida and New Mexico. Politically conservative states with a heavy religious orientation like Utah and Mississippi. Business states like Delaware. Delaware, for example, has very business-friendly incorporation laws, so that many businesses that you think might be located somewhere else in the country are in fact incorporated in Delaware. And many states have urban and rural or upstate and downstate splits. New York is one example. Illinois is another. In part, that reflects the geography, with Chicago being up north, and then the downstate with huge population center in and around Chicago. Just the reverse in New York, where downstate New York City is obviously a huge city with many millions of people, and then smaller town New York upstate. This will be our last slide probably. So we're now pretty much in an era, it can change, but for now in an era of divided government. And some significant changes occurred beginning in about 1964. One was, keep in mind, up until 1964, almost everybody who got elected to the Congress from the South was a Democrat. And up until 1964, very few African Americans had a secure and clear right to vote in southern states. There was still the poll tax, the literacy test, and so on. And so in 1964, what happened in the Democratic Party's National Convention is that the convention voted to seat the MFDP, which stands for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in Mississippi brought forth to the convention delegates from Mississippi who were all white, because basically blacks had few, if any, political rights in much of the South, including Mississippi. And in fact, there were murders, quite a few murders of African Americans and civil rights workers in Mississippi just prior to the convention. And so the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was an integrated delegation from Mississippi, and segregated delegation was not seated, and the integrated delegation was. And that was a sign from the Democratic Party to the southern states, which had been wholly Democratic and white dominated, that was no longer acceptable. And that was one of many actions taken that, as well as actions by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, that drove slowly but surely the southern states into realign and to become Republican. And so in increasingly since 1964-65, more and more people in the southern states shifted, with the exception of Florida, shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Most of the people in Congress now from the South are Republican. Most of the governors are Republican. Usually most of those states in the South vote for the Republican Party candidate for president. We're out of time, and we'll pick up on this slide next time. But this represents one of the few but huge transformations in state and regional party identification. See you next time.
I'm sorry.